Good evening. Welcome to Expat Insights. I'm your host, Raju Manthian. Here at Expat Insights, we take external views of internal successes. And sometimes we also take objective views of subjective successes. Today, we will take up a topic that is very important to all Asians and, of course, to the whole world. We'll take up the subject matter of corporate governance. What is it? How does it matter in terms of the Asian integration that's happening? And to discuss this topic with us is a very important guest, a friend of mine, somebody who chairs the La Salle University in the Philippines, a former board member of Asian Institute of Management. He has sat on nearly 30 boards of companies, and today he is on the board of 8 to 10 companies, a gentleman of Philippine origin, man known by many today, Professor Dr. Francis Estrada. No doctor yet.
Doctor. No doctor.
So Professor and
not even a professor. Not even a professor.
Mr. Estrada, yes. Welcome to Expat Insights.
Thank you very much, Raju.
Sir, before we go into the subject matter of corporate governance and what's happening in the Asian region, perhaps you'd like to give my audience a little brief about what have you done in the last so many years for this country. You've done a lot, but the most important thing that you might have done for this country.
Very difficult to first of all presume to have done important things.
Okay,
that's number one.
That's
a very rather presumptuous statement, but I have I started really in university. I was in university at a time of great ferment in the Philippines. This was the first. No, this was the late 60s, early 70s. So this was the first quarter storm.
All right.
At that point, I was very active in at that stage and became, in fact, the chairman of the student government.
This is in what university?
In De La Salle. That was 1970-71. So this was before martial law, the declaration of martial law. And it was very interesting. It was a very profound thing. It was also kind of unusual that social ferment made us look at realities that were not terribly pleasant, especially coming from an educational institution that was among the elite private institutions. When I finished, I'm finishing that program, and you had a lot of anger in the streets, as it were, and we were very much part of that. The next question was, what the heck do you do?
Right.
And so I did, in many respects, what I had done at that particular time was basically, since nobody wanted to hire a dyed-in-the-wool radical,
right.
One of the things that the default option in many ways, which was quite unusual at that stage, was to go to do your master's, your MBA.
In the 70s, yeah.
At that particular time. So I joined the Asian Institute of Management, and I shall always be appreciative and grateful that they made an exception in terms of they normally require a couple of years work experience before you are admitted to the MBA program. And they made that exception, and that, in fact, began to shape a lot of my thinking. So after that, after a very intense period where I had to adjust to a different paradigm, I was looking at macro issues. My undergraduate degrees were basically literature to feed the soul, and a minor in economics, and management to feed the body.
Right.
So I had an AB and a BSBA.
Yeah.
And now, here I was, having taken it at the institute, I focused on essentially finance, marketing, and strategy.
Yeah.
Very fascinating. We had a very eclectic group of students. You had Filipinos that were, a lot of outstanding Filipinos, but many of them are now very prominent.
Right.
We had Indians, we had Koreans, Japanese, Pakistanis, we had Singaporeans, etc. So it was a very healthy ferment, and that we did among our class were current CEO of the PLDT group, members of cabinet, Jing Lapus, Angie Reyes, who was then a captain. The late Angie Reyes. Yeah. A whole bunch of really outstanding people. That was interesting. I did 1 year after the MBA program. I was basically marketing soap. I was marketing soap. I was with Procter & Gamble.
P&G, yeah.
P&G was doing brand management, which was, of course, a very big difference from what I had done before. Until finally I was I was invited by who I consider my intellectual mentor to this day and a very dear friend, Mr. Sixto Rojas, Rojas, to join this animal called an investment bank. It was called Bancom, the Bancom Group. And as his executive assistant and sort of head of the Office of the President, having understood only the theory of financial intermediation,
in school, yeah,
etc., and also out of school.
Yeah.
It was a fascinating, but more importantly, exposed to a person who to this day, I would argue, was probably one of the great visionaries that I have ever met, bar any nationality.
This is not Sixto Rojas.
This is Sixto Rojas.
Right.
It was a very great educational experience. After about a year and a half, the wisdom in the part of the bank and Mr. Rojas was that he had a major concept, and this was to create a network of ASEAN financial institutions.
Yeah.
And they basically said, and it was going to be owned by ASEAN investors, and it was going to compete against the international conglomerates, banking institutions, on the basis of a much better understanding of the local economies and the local projects.
Yeah.
So my assignment as a kid, this was a kid really out of graduate school.
In your mid-20s and 30s, you were
I was about 25.
Yeah.
The decision was to go and be brought and take over Indonesia. I was going to be the country head for Indonesia, where we established a joint venture with the Central Bank of Indonesia.
This is the local Bancom.
This is the local Philippine Bancom, but we created an overseas holding company.
In partnership with the Central Bank of Indonesia?
No, the partnership was this overseas holding company with the Central Bank of Indonesia.
Right, yeah.
They had a subsidiary, an investment bank that was called a Lembaga Keuangan in Indonesian. And ironically, this was the time of the consortium financial institutions all over London, New York, primarily London. And so you had something like 8 major overseas investors in this institution that together accounted for 50% of the equity. 50% of the equity was owned by the Indonesian Central Bank. But as we found out, because they were so small, the interests were so small, nobody put the first team into the game.
In the partnership.
In the partnership, they would put the second or third team. And predictably, as a consequence, the institution eroded about 3/4 of its capital. So my boss, Mr. Rojas, basically convinced his friends, the Minister of Finance and the Governor of the Central Bank, that here's my guy, and we're going to turn this around and do all sorts of exciting things with the Indonesian financial markets. Well, I guess a lot of it out of luck, and God was very kind to me. We had a very good team. Within 15 months, we had turned it around. Within 18 months, it had become #1 in the industry, a position that it kept for the next 20 years.
Sir, we need to take a break.
Sure.
Yeah? We need to take a break. We'll come back, and I'd like to ask you a little bit about, before we go into the subject matter of corporate governance and what's happening in Asia and the whole world, how much has Philippines changed? So let's hold that question, and we'll come back and talk to Mr. Francis Estrada about how Philippines has changed from the period of the 70s up until now, and then we'll go into the subject matter of corporate governance and Asian integration. So stay with us. I'm your host, Raju Mantian, and this is Expat Insights. Good evening. Welcome back to Expat Insights. I'm your host, Raju Mantian. We are talking to Mr. Francis Estrada, the chairman of De La Salle University, and we are on the subject matter of corporate governance and Asian integration. He just finished telling us about his past and how Philippines has changed, but let's get that question done. How has Philippines changed in your perspective in the last 40 years, sir?
Well, when I first went to the region, which is to say Indonesia, and began to work within the ASEAN area, as you've heard very often said, you've had the Filipino professional was ubiquitous all over the region. You had people, Filipino professional investment bankers, commercial bankers, accountants, etc., engineers, and so forth, and they were held in fairly high regard. And in countries ranging from Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, throughout the region. Now, mirroring the economics of how the region has evolved,
Yes, sir.
that prominence has kind of declined. But the good news, I think, is, among other things, is that there is now a greater realization on the part of Filipinos, as a general rule, I find, of the importance of the region to the country.
Yeah.
For the longest
That will
time, we
bring
had
us to our
looked
topic,
west.
actually, yeah.
We had looked west,
Yeah, yeah.
and that was basically where the paradigm was.
Right,
We
right.
now recognize that, especially with the cataclysm that
Right.
we are experiencing right now, we're
Yeah.
now recognizing that that's no longer quite where we should be looking.
Might become beneficial to us. Highly beneficial, not just beneficial, but really give us an edge on growth.
Well, yes, and in fact, I would say even beyond that, I would say that it is not a question of being more beneficial, it would be much more logical and compelling, because here is where the action and the growth is.
Right, right.
We know that consumption is not going to recover in any significant degree either in the United States or in Western Europe. The growth markets are going to be essentially the emerging markets, and where China, India, Southeast Asia, and Asia in general are really going to be very important drivers.
So that's a sad thing to hear, that consumption might not recover in the West. Huh?
Well, it will recover at some point,
Yeah,
but it is very difficult to look, given the fiscal deficits, given their savings rates,
yeah.
and given the cut in basically in economic standards
Right.
that are going all across from Greece, Portugal, Italy, Spain,
Right,
all
right.
over. It's very difficult to imagine that coming back anywhere before 5 years.
5 or 10 years
Yeah.
easily. So now on the subject matter of corporate governance, now, from the perspective of corporations, number one, and also in the country, can you define for us, for our audience here, what is corporate governance, what is it, and what can we do with it, given the current scenario?
Corporate governance, I guess, in a way, you might consider, you might define as a code of behavior,
Right.
a code of practice
Yeah.
in the way corporations or organizations, for that matter, it
Right.
also refers to public sector, conduct themselves.
Correct.
Now, there are issues in the corporate side that
Yeah.
are assumed,
Yeah.
and presumed. For example, that there is transparency, there is accountability,
True.
and there
Yeah.
is fairness.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it is important. Corporate governance basically speaks of the need to ensure that all stakeholders are properly treated. The old paradigm was the corporation existed to maximize shareholder value.
Correct.
The current paradigm now says that that's not sustainable.
They're not just it, there's more to it. Yeah.
There are more stakeholders other
Yeah.
than the shareholders.
Right.
Suppliers, employees, etc.
Even the neighbors, even the community that we
Even the
live in. No?
community, exactly.
In terms of the quality of corporate governance in the Philippines and all Asia, how do we stand? What is our ranking in terms of ethics, in terms of accountability?
Well, I will have to declare my position here to respond to that question. In fairness, I must be transparent. I'm vice chair of an organization here called the Institute for Corporate Directors, whose principal advocacy is precisely good corporate governance. And we have been working at this for the last 10 years, over 10 years. This is chaired by Jesse Stanislao.
Yeah, the
That's
former finance secretary.
Former finance secretary. Now, you have had a very controversial survey that was done about maybe about a year ago, by what is called the Asian Corporate Governance Association in Hong Kong, that rated us among the worst in Asia. We have, in fact, in spite of all the work that has been, the efforts that have been made,
Yeah.
it has rated us below Indonesia, a country who traditionally we had
Was
been
known for its
for its
life.
problems of governance, etc.
Yeah.
There are areas in which the institution I belong to takes strong exception.
Yeah.
But I think the message that really came out is that the criticism, the fundamental criticism, is that we comply, the attitude of compliance is the compliance to the form and not necessarily to the substance,
essence, to the essence
substance
of,
of the governance reforms.
Yeah, that's a sad thing.
That is a sad thing, but
Yeah.
there are very specific efforts that are being taken up by both the private sector
Today.
today, as well as the major agencies involved, i.e. the central bank has been BSP has been very important, the Office of the Insurance Commissioner, the SEC, they seem to, everybody's trying to work.
And the project that I recently heard about was Arrancada.
Well, Arrancada is a separate initiative.
It doesn't influence governance, or it does
too? Of course it does. It is also, it is in order to mobilize and gain traction for development. Clearly, good governance is fundamental, a fundamental principle, if only to be able to transparently measure and evaluate your progress against very defined objectives.
Now take this discussion, sir, for us to the level of what is happening in the region, how our borders are coming down in terms of trade, in terms of investment, and what do we have to do as Filipinos, as a country, to make the most out of this?
Okay, well, interesting. For the longest time, as you know, the Philippines had been dependent. The Philippines, by the way, unlike Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, has a relatively small component of its economy committed to exports, essentially, that are really related to exports. We have been fairly insulated in that respect and concentrating on our domestic demand. Number one. Number two, what has happened, and I just came from a conference on the ASEAN, essentially, we have now seen the whole region, for the first time, the bulk of its trade is no longer to the west, it is intra-regional. It is intra-regional. So that is very significant. Now, what do we do to use this? What it means is that our educational systems must equip our students to understand our region a lot better, our culture, our mores, our practices. Our focus has been basically US-centric, or to a lesser extent, maybe Japanese-centric to some extent, and then European-centric, as opposed to the countries around us. So we must understand them better, and we must understand how we can work with them, and not fear them. We must do that.
There are two things I want to ask you on that aspect. Number one, I do know that AIM, maybe 10, 15 years ago, decided to have Look East policy, and they also changed their curriculum based on what you just mentioned. It was 10 years ago, I think they said Look East. They worked on their curriculum, and they included a lot of Asian principles in their subjects. That was one. The second question, two questions, let me give you. The second one is that you mentioned that we were restricting our exports. Thereby, there was a lot of protection given to local manufacturers, or internal consumption was high. Did you say that?
No. Let me address the first one first. No. Well, actually, when you really get down to think of it, AIM was established in 1968.
Right.
And it was established in a partnership among the Harvard Business School. You had essentially two leading private universities, the Ateneo de Manila and De La Salle University. And basically two major social donors. One being the Ayala family, the Ayalas, and then the other, the Lopezes. The Ayalas contributed the land, the Lopezes contributed the building. Now, from the start, the idea was to create the leading graduate school of management in the Asian region.
With the model being Harvard.
With the model, pedagogical model, not necessarily content. Pedagogical model meaning the case method. It was the case method that was utilized. However, it is evident that if you are going to be the leading graduate school of management in the region, you must have content that is relevant to the region. If you took something from mainstream Cleveland, Ohio, a case, it may have application in a generic sense, but in a practical, down-to-earth, nuts and bolts sense, it may not have. So I argue that by definition, from the start,
we were
the heart and the soul of the Institute was Asia, and it should be Asia. That's point number one. Your second question, if you remind me.
You said that we were high on consumption, therefore less on exports compared to other Asian countries.
No, what I meant by that is that was not a deliberate effort on our part. It was simply a default mechanism, simply because we did not have a Park Chung-hee of Korea who basically drove the export drive. We did not have a Japan where MITI, the Ministry of Industry and Trade, Trade and Industry rather, drove the whole structure of the economy in favor of exports.
Or what they're doing with China in the last so many years, yeah.
China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, all of those were export-driven economies. But that model no longer holds right now. It's a little late in the game
for us
to get into that.
Maybe 30 years ago it was the right move.
Absolutely.
So that was the scenario. Today, sir, what is happening? Today, a while ago, before we met for this interview, you said, Raju, there's a big issue, a big debate on nationalism and regionalism. Perhaps you'd like to give us insights on what is the right path to follow.
Well, that's a big question, Raju, but I will only share with you a personal opinion.
Your personal point of view,
opinion. The conventional wisdom, which is a linear form of reasoning, suggests that the way forward is that you need strong nation states in order to have a strong region. And yet, if you study the sweep of history, you may observe a little bit of a different pattern, because the good news is when you have strong nation states and you have strong sentiments of nationalism, it is very difficult to put them together. Witness how long it took the European Union, the European community, to come together. You had the historical animosities between the Germans and the French, the UK and the French. You have the continent and the non-continent. Historical patterns that become impediments to integration. So the question really is must we follow that linear pattern, where the logic is overwhelmingly clear? The logic of working together as opposed to working as small, insignificant, relatively insignificant economies is the question. Can we begin to do that? Now, there is some evidence that enlightened self-interest can drive us there. There is some anecdotal evidence at this point, not totally
drive us to nationalism, not
In other words, you have had cases where, for example, conflicts between Brunei and Malaysia where have been decided at great political risk in favor of a longer-term strategic interest. You now have, let us see if this issue between Cambodia and Thailand is very similarly resolved.
There is an issue between
there was a bombing and exchange of artillery fire.
And this is just for trade?
No, nothing to do with trade. It had to do, some people, with a particular temple.
I know
temple
that.
Now, the issue really is, some observers will say that that was politically driven to distract from a political issue.
Which can happen.
But again, when you look at the continuum, the idea and my hope, having dedicated my life actually to basically intra-regional capital flows and so forth, I am a believer, and I'm very hopeful that at some point we will begin to focus on our common aspirations, cultural values as a region.
Keeping the cultures intact. Keeping the cultures at least, if not intact, at least safe enough.
Maintaining the integrity of our respective cultures. But I do not suggest, by the way, a jingoist kind of mindset. I do not suggest that we are going to do this to the exclusion of the rest of the world. I simply say that we have our home base, which is a broader home base. Which are about 20 to 30 nations, Well, probably a little smaller. I would put Southeast Asia, some of East Asia, and the subcontinent. But I would really basically think that we together would represent, ASEAN would represent what? About 600 plus million and about $1.6 trillion in GDP together. Individually, you're much smaller. Now, you're really, if you start looking and extending beyond that, if you bring in China and India and Northeast Asia, you're talking of Korea,
Mongolia,
Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong. You're talking of a fairly serious engine.
More than half the world.
More than half. And when you look at the savings, you're really talking of more than 2/3 of global savings. Now, that is telling you something very serious.
Thanks to China for that.
Well, not just China. I mean, you look at the reserves that are held not just in China, by Korea, by Japan. China is holding north of $3 trillion in reserves. Japan ain't too shabby either. They're running close to $2 trillion. And Korea and so forth, Taiwan, Singapore, Malaysia, and the Philippines. For the first time, it's not quite in that league, but it is showing very large reserves.
Well, so as a country, as Philippines, what kind of direction should we take? What kind of strategy should we kind of create for ourselves so that we can be ahead of the game and still not lose our essence and make gains from the integration that's happening naturally or by design?
Well, since I lived and worked throughout the region, as you know, for
Yeah.
more than 22 years,
Yeah.
and I continue to travel throughout the region, conclusions, a couple of observations rather than conclusions.
For us, this is for the
Yes.
country, yeah.
The Filipino, unlike the Indonesian, the Vietnamese, even the Malaysian, the Thai,
Yeah.
the Filipino probably has, the bad news rather, is the Filipinos' culture is not quite as assertive, not quite as distinct. We are an amalgam of Malay, there is a little bit of the colonial history, a combination, and it's much more regional. The Ilocanos are a little different, the Tagalogs are a little different,
Yeah.
the Visayans are
Yeah.
different, etc. So the bad news is there is no one culture that is as strong as, for example, the Han Chinese culture,
Right.
or
right.
the Japanese culture,
Right.
or
right.
the Malay culture in Indonesia, the Javanese culture, which is 70% of the
So
population.
there's no leading culture amongst these four or
No,
five
there's
regions.
not.
Yeah.
That's the bad news.
Not the Tagalog.
Not.
the Tagalog, yeah.
The good news is,
Yeah.
because of that, we adapt very easily and very well, better than most others,
Right.
to other environments, because we do not have an assertive, imposing, underlying culture that says
Right.
we are superior.
Right.
So
Okay.
you will see Filipino professionals and Filipinos in different parts of the world
Adapting, becoming, integrating,
adapting,
really
thriving, and they are the glue.
Mhm.
And they operate where you have good governance. You will see that they perform very well. Give them a break, and they will perform as well as anybody else, and even better. They work hard. They do all sorts of things. So I think that the Filipino can be the glue throughout the region. For example, you look at India. Give you an example.
We have a strong culture.
You have a very strong culture,
Yeah.
and there is a personality. The Indians generally, and this is generalities are
leaving
odious.
me out. Leaving me out.
Leaving you out. Leaving you out. Typically, if you look at the manpower pools, you have very strong analytics. India,
Yeah.
as opposed to China, invested heavily in tertiary education. China invested heavily in primary and secondary education. Okay?
Right,
So
right.
you have a lot of engineering talent and technical talent.
Research,
Excellent
yes,
schools. The Indian Institutes of Technology are superb.
Yeah.
However, and in practice, they're very strong on analytics, but not terribly strong on the soft skills, on customer skills. That's
Yeah,
not their
yeah,
strength.
Yeah.
Creativity, in terms of business creativity, again, they're fairly strong on the orthodoxies and on the scientific models, but not in the traditional creative areas, other than in the movies and in the arts, where they are
They
excellent.
segregate the
They
two.
segregate.
They segregate the two.
They
They
split them.
divide. Yeah.
The Filipino, on the other hand, may not be as strong on the analytics, but very strong on the people skills,
Yeah.
extremely strong on the people, customer skills, and creativity.
And
That's-
integrating creativity
and integrating.
in business,
And the one thing that we must always say, that the Filipino is fundamentally a happy person. You may have floods, you may have earthquakes, you may have whatever, but it's very hard to put the Filipino down.
Thus, engagement is high, resistance in terms of changes low. Yeah? Sir, let's take a little break one more time.
Sure.
And post this, we come back and take this to the ground level as to how this will apply to the man on the street and what do small businesses do. Yeah?
Great.
We'll take it to that level and bring it back to corporate governance in terms of small and medium scales. So we are with Mr. Francis Estrada. We are talking on corporate governance and Asian integration. I'm your host, Raju Mandya. Stay with us. We'll come back and talk to him some more. This is Expat Insights. Welcome back to Expat Insights. I'm your host, Raju Mandya. We are talking to Mr. Francis Estrada, the chairman of De La Salle University, and we are on the subject matter of corporate governance and the Asian integration. He just finished telling us about what is happening at the Asian level and what Philippines can do about it, but let's take this to the global level, sir. And given that U.S. is suffering today, there's a crisis in U.S. and Europe, what are we going to do about it? How do we position ourselves so that we don't get harmed with this?
Well, in a world that has been globalizing, Raju, I fear that there is no silver bullet in terms of totally insulating ourselves. Our interdependencies have been built. However, we can reduce the impact of that. Because we have, in many ways, Asia has learned from the '97 crisis. We have managed our external debt. We have brought our fiscal house in order.
Yeah.
We have done all these things painfully.
Did we recover well, you think?
We recovered extremely well, and that witness to that, how strong the economy is.
That includes not just our country, but the whole region.
The whole region.
Yeah.
Now, the countries that have suffered most in our region, if you'll notice, are the ones that were dependent on export-led growth, because the bulk of their demand that they were depending on were essentially in the United States and Europe. And hence, they were the ones that were most affected. Now, what is going to happen? What has fueled much of the growth in the United States? As you know, the United States, 70% of the economy is consumption.
Yep.
Okay? Much of that consumption was driven beyond their savings rates.
There was
And
a huge
lot of
deficit,
that
yeah.
was fueled by Asian savings. In fact, primarily Chinese savings, but basically Asian savings. Why do I say that?
Yeah.
It was Asian savings that funded the deficits, which were funded by U.S. Treasury bonds.
Yeah.
And who bought the bonds? Asian central banks, etc.
Right.
Okay, the
yeah.
bulk of it. Of course, the Saudi Arabians were big contributors, but in terms of total amounts, that's what we were talking about.
Yeah.
What the IMF and the European Central Bank, the U.S. Federal Reserve, and the European community are trying to suggest, and this is something I take strong exception
You have
to.
you have a peeve against that.
Well, not an emotional peeve, but one that I think conceptually is it's conceptual peeve is this.
Yeah.
They are trying to argue in favor of what they call rebalancing. And what rebalancing means
Yeah.
is really increasing the domestic consumption in Asia, very much to approximate or to mirror the Western models.
Well, Western and European models.
Now,
yeah.
can you imagine for one moment, forget about U.S. standards of waste and profligacy. Talk about European standards, 50% of the standards. If we all went and started eating the way they ate, we started having all the appliances, the cars, etc.
Well,
Bring that to India and China.
I'm not pretty smart. I think the gap between the rich and poor will become ghastly.
Well, not only that, but the
Yeah.
invasiveness in the environment. We don't have the infrastructure to support that. How
Yeah.
many chickens are you going to have to produce in order to have everybody to have the same number of McDonald's or Kentucky Fried Chickens eaten per 1,000
Or
population?
to spend $5 a meal, which is what they say. Yeah.
Exactly. So what I'm saying is that's not sustainable. So we have to go back to our roots, our basic values, that really, and talk about sustainability of the model. And the rural areas, we have seen the model that favors moving people from the rural areas into the urban areas. That is something that is not sustainable, and we've seen that. The idea is to create activity and growth in the rural areas, in the agricultural sector.
More of the power, the utilities, the
Utilities,
infrastructure.
water, sanitation, etc.
Yeah.
There are more cell phones. Cell phones around in many, many instances. In India, for example, to a lot of people that do not have clean sanitation. And we don't, but they have cell phones.
Sir, this is something I need a little bit clarity on. I came across a study somewhere which said that if concentration of people per square meter is higher, that reduces wastage and consumption of our natural resources, compared to like how United States or Australia has laid out, where little townships are far away, so the distance of travel, the logistics actually uses up a lot of our natural resources. So is that a true theory? Is that possible?
No, that is absolutely the
Is
wisdom,
that advisable?
the urban planning wisdom is precisely that. It says that the notion, the Southern California model of gated communities, which are horizontal developments, and horizontal, but they eat up a lot of space for relatively few people, is not a sustainable model for precisely the reasons that you say. What you want to do is optimize essentially the use of the footprint, your footprint.
But from the same perspective, a while ago we thought that it's great to bring utilities, power and infrastructure to the non-urban areas, to the rural areas.
That's not contradictory.
That's not the same?
In the sense that you could have housing developments that are vertical in rural areas, but utilizing and preserving as much of the productive agricultural land for use. And really looking at productive methods of really optimizing production at the
So like having large villages.
Exactly.
Large modern-day villages.
Modern villages, and looking at sustainable forms of power. For example, well, you know,
any
the
other
alternative
besides
solar,
yeah.
As opposed to purely fossil-fired energy.
Yeah. All right. So wait, the statement that you were making is.
No, I was basically saying that what the idea of rebalancing, the underlying premise there is that we would follow the U.S. and Western model to build and feed the rising consumer expectations, Western consumer expectations. I'm saying that's probably not sustainable. And we should begin saying that we must live within the context of our environments. We must not be wasteful. We must make sure that our priorities are right. Water, sanitation for the bulk of the population must be made available.
Right.
And businesses and enterprises must now think beyond quarter-to-quarter profits, responding to Wall Street, to the financial markets, as opposed to responding to their true broader base of stakeholders. Now, what I mean by that is that you no longer should evaluate a CEO purely on the basis of his return on equity, the return on equity that he delivers every year. But you must also be put in that metric a measure of how sustainable that is. How many people, and how does he work within his community? If he is not, or if the enterprise does not contribute to the communities it serves, that cannot be a sustainable model. And when I'm talking about communities, I mean employees, I mean customers, I mean a whole bit.
I'm taking two companies. Let's say company A, company B. Company A does X $million. Company B does X $million.
Profit or sales?
Revenues, X million. And they employ 8,000 people. This company employs 60,000 people. No? So in terms of that, which CEO is handling the business well?
Well, hard to make that judgment because in a way, in the end, the CEO must be mindful of who funds him, where he gets his capital. And people will not fund you. You may have 60,000 employees, but if you're losing a hand over fist, the argument is they will not fund you. Now, what I'm saying is there is a middle ground that when we make decisions, if you have projects, I will allocate capital. There are 10 alternative projects with different internal rates of return, IRRs. Okay? I don't have to look at the home run all the time at a 40% IRR, internal rate of return, when that benefits a very, very, very small public and of the community, part of my community, as opposed to a project that generates a 20% IRR, but really broadens the benefits over a wider component of your community. That's what I'm saying. The conventional wisdom is the arithmetic. It says 40% over 20, no-brainer. Go for it.
Let's go for it,
Now, what I'm saying is that's a little different from taking a longer-term perspective.
So this turnovers in terms of monetary returns is not just the issue, but also turnovers in terms of people, in terms of resources.
And sustainability.
In
other words, the argument is sustainability, because if you're not sustainable, the essence, the whole purpose, why do enterprises exist? They're supposed to build a better society, provide employment and all of that, right? So if the very logic of enterprise requires...
So what would be the top 3 suggestions that you and I could make today, come up with for the state and for corporations today to act upon?
I think what is happening in some jurisdictions, witness among
in Asia?
No, in the United States, in Europe, in particularly publicly listed companies. People basically, in addition to your traditional annual reports that focus on the business, you are beginning to report on issues like CSR. You're beginning to report on issues of the environment, what measures the company or the enterprise has taken with respect to the environment. But I think we must also begin to think of scorecards that really relate to sustainability programs.
So there are external bodies measuring this, watching this.
There are
besides the compliances.
There are attempts, and academia has been developing some of these models, and there are various attempts. But I think there should be a more defined, harmonious effort between private sector, academia, and the regulatory community to begin looking at essentially what are the appropriate metrics to use for this purpose.
So, sir, what do we see for the man on the street now, for the stakeholder in the coming years, given this big picture view that we have taken and what might happen and what we can do? What's happening for the man on the street in the coming
For the man on the street, I think to the extent that private business and government begins to internalize and not just mouth the rhetoric that we keep hearing of inclusive growth and sustainability. To the extent that private enterprise begins to adopt that as a paradigm that they utilize, I think we're going to have a good future. I think our country, together with countries like India, like Indonesia, demographically, we are going to be producing what are called the sweet spot demographic, which is to say the bulk of the population being at the 20 to 35 sort of area, productive areas, much as opposed to China, as opposed to Japan, as opposed to Korea, as opposed to these countries. That is a boon or a bane. If we are able to give them the right skills that are relevant and correspond, it is a boom. We would be able to supply the needs beyond our own shores. On the other hand, to the extent that we do not, we are creating huge social volcano. So that, Raju, is our challenge.
So thank you very much for being on this show. If there's anything else that you'd like to add to the discussion we had, this is your moment, and you can also probably address your community at LaSalle.
Well, I just wanted to clarify that you're very kind. I was the chairman of De La Salle College. I finished my term about a week and a half ago. I finished my term, but I continue to sit on De La Salle Philippines, the board and National Mission Council, and I continue to chair the investment committee of the 17 La Salle schools. But I think I make this call essentially to not just the academic, but to the business community. I'm saying that we have a number of imperatives to deal with, but most of these imperatives require academia and private sector to work very closely together to identify not just the needs today, but to begin to anticipate what are the needs tomorrow and tailor training programs in a way that we produce the jobs and the skills that really correspond to each other.
So these top schools in Philippines today, Ateneo, La Salle, and AIM, of course, where you have been active, are doing this?
Well, there is an effort to do that, yes, to engage, but I think we have to intensify that enormously.
Salamat po, sir. Mabuhay. So that was Mr. Francis Estrada talking about corporate governance and the Asian integration. And next week on Expat Insights, we will have Fred Lewis from Hope Cybery, and we will also have Dr. Yap from Ateneo to talk about health and wellness. So I'm your host, Raju Mandhian. Stay watching Expat Insights every Sunday night, 9 p.m. I'd also like to today, before we close, wish Mr. Leo Makalintal, Colonel Leo Makalintal, a friend of mine, a happy birthday. It's his birthday today. It's also the birthday of Mr. Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi of India.
Wonderful.
So good night and mabuhay.
Thank you.